They were told they would be safe. As men and women of God, the Catholic priests and nuns believed their cloth would protect them even in the darkest corner of Nazi Germany. But inside Auschwitz, behind the walls of what became known as Block 28, these servants of faith discovered a hell that few outside have ever heard about. Their story remained buried for decades, a chapter of Holocaust history systematically erased because it didn't fit neatly into the narrative we've been told. What really happened to the clergy in Auschwitz? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this story was hidden for so long, and how these forgotten martyrs challenge everything we thought we knew about faith in humanity's darkest hour. Poland, 1939. Before the world knew the horrors that would unfold, life for Catholic clergy was centered around service, prayer, and community. Parish priests delivered sermons to devoted congregations, while nuns ran schools, orphanages, and hospitals. They were respected figures in Polish society, educators, caregivers, and spiritual guides. Many came from humble beginnings, farmers' sons and daughters who felt called to serve God. None could have imagined that within months, their Roman collars and habits would mark them for special attention from the Nazi regime that had just invaded their homeland with overwhelming force and murderous intent. The German occupation of Poland wasn't just about territorial conquest, it was cultural decimation. While the Jewish population faced immediate persecution, the Nazis also targeted Polish intellectuals, political leaders, and Catholic clergy. Hitler understood that to break Poland's spirit, he needed to break its soul. The church represented both Polish national identity and a potential source of resistance. In the early days, priests were arrested for infractions as minor as continuing to deliver sermons in Polish rather than German. Some were executed in town squares as examples, others disappeared into the growing network of camps. By 1940, over 2,000 Polish clergy had been arrested, but their destination remained largely unknown to their parishioners who prayed for their return. What few realized was that deep within the expanding complex of Auschwitz, Block 28 was becoming home to hundreds of priests and Block 27 to dozens of nuns. They arrived not knowing what to expect, still wearing their clerical garments, clutching rosaries and Bibles that were quickly confiscated. The SS guards mockingly called it the monastery, a cruel joke considering what would unfold within those walls. Unlike Jewish prisoners who were immediately identified by their yellow stars, the clergy wore red triangles marking them as political prisoners. This categorization would prove crucial to their experience, subjecting them to treatment that differed in specific and calculated ways from other prisoners. The world knows Auschwitz for its gas chambers and crematoria, for the notorious medical experiments of Josef Mengele, for the systematic murder of over 1 million people. But few know about the deliberate program to break the spirit of those who represented spiritual resistance. The clergy of Block 28 faced unique torments designed not just to kill their bodies, but to destroy their faith, to prove that even God had abandoned this place. As we uncover their story, you'll witness both unimaginable cruelty and extraordinary courage. You'll learn why the SS feared the power of faith, and why certain Nazi officers took special pleasure in watching men and women of God suffer. This is the story they didn't want told. The hidden chapter of Auschwitz, where the war against religion revealed the regime's darkest ambitions. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of an orchestrated assault on the Catholic Church. The Nazis understood that to control Poland they needed to break its spiritual backbone. Within months, over 2,000 Polish clergy had been arrested. Many were executed publicly as examples, while others disappeared into the growing network of concentration camps spreading across occupied territories. The Catholic Church, with its deep ties to Polish national identity, represented a threat to Nazi control, a potential source of resistance that Hitler was determined to crush. While much of the world would later learn about the systematic murder of Europe's Jewish population, far fewer would hear about the targeted persecution of Catholic clergy that began in the earliest days of the war. In the cold winter of 1940, a new group of prisoners began arriving at Auschwitz. Unlike the other inmates with their varied colored badges, yellow stars for Jews, green triangles for criminals, pink for homosexuals, These men and women wore red triangles identifying them as political prisoners. But the SS guards had another name for them, one uttered with contemptuous mockery: the monastery. Block 28 quickly became known throughout the camp as the priests' block, while neighboring Block 27 housed captured nuns. These religious men and women came primarily from Poland, but also included clergy from other occupied territories who had opposed Nazi rule or helped hide Jewish families. Upon arrival, their religious garments were replaced with striped prison uniforms, their rosaries and prayer books confiscated. Their heads were shaved, and they were assigned numbers that would replace their names. The Nazi treatment of clergy within Auschwitz revealed a particular cruelty directed at those who represented spiritual authority. Inside Block 28, Catholic priests faced what survivors would later describe as a deliberate program to break not just their bodies, but their souls. Guards would force priests to perform humiliating acts that mocked their sacred vows. They were given the most physically demanding labor assignments, carrying heavy stones, digging drainage ditches in freezing conditions, or working in the dreaded gravel pit where many collapsed from exhaustion. The daily rations for clergy were often further reduced as punishment, leaving them to survive on even less than the starvation diet provided to other inmates. SS officers took particular delight in forcing priests to work on Sundays and holy days, a calculated attempt to prevent any observance of sacred rituals. For the nuns in Block 27, the situation was equally dire but carried additional horrors. Female guards subjected the women religious to degrading strip searches and mockery of their vows of chastity. Their hair, often never cut before due to religious tradition, was roughly shaved, an act survivors described as spiritually traumatic. Many nuns were assigned to work in the camp laundries or kitchens, where they faced constant harassment from guards. Others were sent to the medical experiments block, where Nazi doctors used them as test subjects for sterilization procedures and other inhumane experiments. The sisters faced these torments while struggling with the same starvation, disease, and exposure that killed thousands of other prisoners each month. Yet even amid this suffering, survivors later recounted how many nuns continued to pray silently while working, using small stones or knots tied in strings as makeshift rosary beads. What made Block 28 different from other areas of the camp was the psychological warfare specifically designed for religious prisoners. Guards would stage mock masses, with SS officers dressing in stolen vestments while forcing priests to watch. Religious images were desecrated in front of clergy, and guards would sometimes read from the Bible while committing acts of violence against prisoners. The most devout priests were often singled out for public humiliation. In a place designed to strip away all human dignity, the Nazis took special care to attack the very foundation of the clergy's identity, their relationship with God. The question that haunted many of these religious prisoners was not whether they would survive physically, but whether their faith could endure such targeted spiritual assault. This psychological torture represented something beyond even the immense physical suffering of the camp. It was an attempt to prove that even God had abandoned Auschwitz. Yet amid the calculated cruelty of Block 28, something remarkable began to emerge, a hidden network of spiritual resistance. Despite the prohibition of religious practices under penalty of death, priests found ways to conduct secret ministry. Using smuggled breadcrumbs and drops of wine, saved from rare packages, they performed clandestine Eucharist services in remote corners of work sites or behind the shelter of cooperative prisoners who would stand watch. Polish Father Adam Zieber later testified how he heard confessions while pretending to have casual conversations during work details, whispering absolution while guards looked away. Some priests carved tiny crosses from discarded wood, which prisoners would pass among themselves for brief moments of prayer. The clergy developed an elaborate system of signals and code words to announce when a secret mass might occur or when a dying prisoner needed last rites, creating what survivors would later call the underground church of Auschwitz, right under the noses of their tormentors. For the nuns in Block 27, their resistance took different forms but displayed equal courage. Many used their positions in camp kitchens or infirmaries to smuggle extra food to the weakest prisoners, often at great risk to themselves. Sisters working in the laundry secretly tore strips from damaged uniforms to create bandages for the sick. In the camp hospital, nuns who had been nurses before imprisonment continued their healing work, offering not just medical care but spiritual comfort to the dying. One Polish Carmelite nun, Sister Angela Maria Auch, became known among prisoners as the Angel of Auschwitz for her extraordinary compassion. She moved between work assignments offering encouragement and small acts of kindness until her death in 1944. These religious women maintained their vows even when stripped of their habits and community, finding ways to practice charity when surrounded by institutionalized hatred. The physical suffering in the clergy blocks intensified as the war progressed. By 1941, an estimated 464 priests and 35 nuns had been deported to Auschwitz, with new arrivals coming regularly. The mortality rate was staggering. Cold, disease, and malnutrition killed many within months of arrival. Others died from beatings when caught praying or helping fellow inmates. Block 28 became known for having one of the highest death rates in the camp, reflecting the especially harsh conditions imposed on the clergy. Those who survived later recalled that on some winter mornings, they would awaken to find that a third of their barracks had died overnight from exposure. The bodies would be stacked like cordwood outside the block, with survivors forced to carry their fellow priests to the crematorium. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, the remaining clergy continued their dangerous spiritual work. The story of the priests' block intersected with some of the most famous acts of sacrifice in Auschwitz history. When a prisoner escaped from the camp in 1941, the Nazi commandant selected 10 men to die of starvation as punishment. When one of the chosen men, Franciszek Gajowniczek, cried out in despair about his wife and children, Polish Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe stepped forward and offered to take his place. The SS officer accepted the exchange with a shrug. Father Kolbe was sent to the starvation bunker in Block 11, where witnesses reported he led the condemned men in prayers and hymns for 2 weeks until he was finally killed by lethal injection. Though celebrated as a singular act of heroism, survivors' accounts reveal that Father Kolbe's sacrifice was part of a broader pattern of clergy placing themselves at risk to protect others in the camp. What made the persecution of Catholic clergy in Auschwitz distinctive was how it revealed a key aspect of Nazi ideology that extended beyond their more documented anti-Semitism. The treatment of priests and nuns demonstrated the regime's fundamental opposition to any power or authority outside their control, especially moral and spiritual authority. SS officers in charge of Block 28 made no secret of their desire to prove that religious faith was meaningless in the face of Nazi power. They would taunt priests with questions about where their God was now, or why he didn't intervene to save them. This ideological battle helps explain why so many priests and nuns faced such specifically designed torments. They represented an alternative worldview and source of hope that the Nazi regime was determined to crush. Their persecution wasn't just about eliminating potential resistance, but about destroying the very concept of spiritual transcendence that challenged Nazi supremacy. Daily life for the clergy in Blocks 27 and 28 followed a brutal rhythm that tested the limits of human endurance. Each morning began at 4 a.m. with the shrieking of whistles and shouting of guards. Priests and nuns were given just minutes to make their bed platforms according to strict regulations. Any imperfection resulted in beatings. Breakfast, if it could be called that, consisted of a thin liquid that passed for coffee and occasionally a small piece of bread that had to last the entire day. Roll call followed, with prisoners forced to stand at attention regardless of weather conditions, sometimes for hours in freezing temperatures or pouring rain. Many elderly priests collapsed during these extended roll calls, only to be beaten by guards or sent to the infirmary where little actual medical care existed. For clergy, these daily rituals of humiliation were often accompanied by special torments, like being forced to recite prayers while doing punishing physical exercises until they collapsed. Work assignments for priests were deliberately chosen to maximize suffering. Many were sent to the penal company, the most feared labor detail in Auschwitz. There, under constant verbal abuse and physical assault from kapos, prisoner supervisors, who were often selected from violent criminal inmates, priests were forced to run while carrying heavy loads of rock and gravel. Guards would set impossible quotas that ensured punishment no matter how hard they worked. Father Vladislav Gross, who somehow survived the camp, later described how priests would sometimes work 16-hour shifts at the gravel pit, with many dying from heart failure or being shot when they couldn't maintain the pace. The nuns faced different but equally exhausting assignments: scrubbing floors, sorting through mountains of belongings stolen from new arrivals, or working in the laundries where the steam and chemicals damaged their lungs and skin. For both priests and nuns, these workdays were designed not just to extract labor but to break them physically and spiritually. Hunger became a constant companion that dominated every thought. The clergy, like other prisoners, received rations insufficient for survival, a fact well known to camp administrators who calculated the gradual starvation of inmates. For priests and nuns who had often lived lives of modest food intake before imprisonment, the adjustment to near-starvation conditions was particularly brutal. Their bodies, many already weakened by age, deteriorated rapidly. Survivors described the mental fog that descended after weeks of starvation, making even prayer difficult, as the mind could focus only on food. This hunger created moral dilemmas that tormented the clergy: whether to eat food one found that might belong to another prisoner, whether to take extra rations when offered by those in privileged positions within the camp, whether to fight for scraps of food, when such behavior contradicted everything they had taught about charity and dignity. These daily choices tested their faith in ways that theological training could never have prepared them for. Disease swept through the blocks regularly, with typhus being particularly devastating. The cramped living conditions, where priests slept 6 or more to a platform designed for 2, created perfect conditions for lice that transmitted the disease. Those infected developed high fevers, excruciating headaches, and a characteristic rash. Many hallucinated in their final days, calling out for their parishes or mothers, as fellow priests tried to comfort them without proper medicine. Medical care was primitive and often experimental. Nazi doctors used the clergy blocks to test various treatments, with little concern for patient survival. The priests and nuns who worked in the camp infirmaries faced impossible choices about which patients might receive the limited medications available. Sister Teresa Benedicta, born Edith Stein, a Jewish philosopher who had converted to Catholicism and become a Carmelite nun, worked briefly in the women's infirmary before being sent to the gas chambers in August 1942. Leaving behind accounts of these moral dilemmas faced by religious medical workers. Despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, an extraordinary sense of community developed among the clergy prisoners. Survivor accounts describe how priests from different countries and theological backgrounds set aside doctrinal differences to support one another. Polish priests shared their occasional food packages with French clerics who received nothing from home. Younger priests carried elderly ones during marches or took on their work quotas when possible. In the evening hours, if guards were not present, small groups would gather on bed platforms to whisper discussions of scripture or theology, intellectual resistance against a regime that sought to reduce them to numbers and labor. Some created informal seminaries, continuing the education of young priests whose studies had been interrupted by arrest. This commitment to maintaining their religious identity and community, even at great risk, represented a profound form of spiritual defiance against the dehumanizing system of the camp. As one surviving nun later testified, they could take our habits, our prayer books, and even our names, but they could not take the church that lived within us. The most dangerous and sacred activities in blocks 27 and 28 were the clandestine religious services. Priests devised ingenious methods to celebrate the Eucharist, which they considered essential to sustaining both their own faith and that of other Catholic prisoners. Small amounts of bread were saved from rations, sometimes dried and stored in matchboxes carried in secret pockets sewn into uniforms. Wine, a necessary element for the Catholic Mass, was more difficult to obtain. In rare instances, sympathetic civilian workers smuggled in small bottles, which were then hidden in medicine containers or diluted to stretch the precious liquid across multiple services. Makeshift altars were created, using overturned food bowls on work detail lunch breaks or in secluded corners of labor sites. Father Kozlowiecki, who survived to become a cardinal after the war, described in his memoirs how he would turn slightly away from other prisoners during these secret masses, using his body to shield the altar while appearing to be resting. The entire liturgy would be performed in whispers or complete silence, with only the most essential prayers included. For Catholic prisoners, the opportunity to receive communion or confession provided profound spiritual sustenance. Historians have documented how news of these secret services spread through whispered networks, with prisoners of all faiths sometimes standing watch to warn of approaching guards. The punishment for participating in religious ceremonies was severe, often transfer to the penal company or outright execution. Yet the risk was considered worthwhile by many prisoners who described these moments of worship as the only times they felt fully human in the camp. Jewish prisoners who shared barracks with Catholic clergy later testified about the respect they developed for these acts of spiritual resistance. One Jewish survivor recalled how a priest who had smuggled a tiny piece of communion bread to a dying Catholic prisoner in the infirmary offered him a blessing as well, saying, "In this place, we are all God's children." These interfaith moments of compassion amid systematic dehumanization represent some of the most powerful testimonies to emerge from the clergy blocks. Winter brought special horrors to the clergy in Auschwitz. The thin prison uniforms provided almost no protection against the bitter Polish cold, and many priests and nuns suffered frostbite that led to amputations. Barracks had minimal heating at best, with prisoners crowding together at night for warmth. Christmas was particularly difficult, a sacred season in their former lives now marked by intensified cruelty from guards who delighted in forcing religious prisoners to work on holy days. SS officers erected decorated Christmas trees near the crematorium as a psychological torment, with some even hanging the bodies of executed prisoners from the branches as a macabre decoration. Yet survivors' accounts reveal that Christmas 1944 saw one of the most audacious religious ceremonies in Block 28, when Father Ladislaw Grosz managed to celebrate a complete midnight mass. Prisoners created a small nativity scene using scraps of cloth and wood, while others sang carols in barely audible whispers. The service was interrupted 3 times by guard patrols, with prisoners quickly hiding all evidence of religious activity before they entered. The most vulnerable clergy were those with Jewish heritage. When the Nazis occupied the Netherlands in May 1940, they began arresting Dutch Jews. When Catholic bishops publicly protested these deportations in July 1942, the Germans retaliated by specifically targeting Jewish converts to Catholicism, including priests and nuns. Edith Stein, Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, was among those arrested, along with her sister Rosa, who had also converted and become a lay assistant at the Carmelite monastery. Both women were transported to Auschwitz and murdered in the gas chambers on August 9, 1942. Their story represents an important intersection of the Holocaust's targeting of Jews and the persecution of Catholic clergy. Other Jewish-born clergy met similar fates, regardless of how long they had been Christians or how prominent they were in religious communities. Their dual identity as both Jews and Catholic religious made them targets of particularly vicious treatment from guards who saw them as doubly offensive to Nazi ideology. Resistance in Block 28 took many forms beyond secret religious services. Priests used their educated backgrounds to maintain morale through clandestine lectures, poetry recitations, and discussions of history or philosophy, creating what some called a university of survival. Some clergy with medical training provided basic healthcare when possible. Others maintained secret diaries documenting the atrocities they witnessed, hoping these records would someday reach the outside world. One of the most remarkable forms of resistance was the priest's efforts to maintain accurate death records of fellow clergy. Father Adam Zieber described in post-war testimony how he memorized the names, dioceses, and dates of death of dozens of fellow priests, reciting this litany to himself each night so the dead would not be forgotten. When asked how he maintained his sanity through such horrors, he explained, "In normal life, a priest helps others prepare for death. In Auschwitz, this remained our ministry, though we ourselves were dying. To remember each name was to affirm that even here, each life mattered to God. This was our act of defiance against a system that sought to reduce us to anonymous ash." By 1943, conditions in the clergy blocks had deteriorated further, as the Nazi war effort faced increasing pressure and camp administrators responded with heightened brutality. Food rations, already inadequate, were reduced again. Work hours extended, while medical care became even more scarce. The clergy, like all prisoners, suffered from the effects of long-term malnutrition. Swollen limbs, skin diseases, and tuberculosis became rampant. Yet amid this intensified suffering, a remarkable phenomenon emerged that many survivors would later describe as the ministry of presence. Unable to offer sacraments to all who needed them, and lacking material goods to share, many priests and nuns developed an approach to spiritual care that focused simply on being present with the suffering. They would sit with dying prisoners, regardless of faith, offering silent companionship in their final hours. Several Jewish survivors later testified about Catholic priests who broke camp rules to visit them in isolation barracks, risking punishment simply to offer words of encouragement or prayer. Sister Angela Maria Ouch became legendary for her ability to appear beside those in greatest distress, sometimes just holding their hand or wiping their brow, small gestures of dignity that meant everything in a place designed to strip humanity away. The underground communication network between blocks 27, 28 and the rest of the camp grew more sophisticated as the war progressed. Priests and nuns used their work assignments to make contact with prisoners in other sections, carrying messages, sharing news of the outside world, and sometimes smuggling small items like medicine or food to those in need. Some clergy who worked in camp offices or storerooms had access to information about incoming transports or planned selections for the gas chambers. They developed warning systems to help vulnerable prisoners prepare or hide when possible. Father Maximilian Kolbe, before his own sacrifice and death, had used his position in the garment warehouse to create a primitive news service, collecting information from newly arrived prisoners about the war's progress and discreetly sharing it to counter Nazi propaganda and maintain hope. This information network represented a significant form of resistance, as the camp administration relied on isolation and misinformation to maintain control over prisoners. The relationship between clergy and guards revealed complex dynamics that went beyond simple victim and perpetrator roles. Some SS officers, particularly those with religious upbringings, displayed occasional moments of discomfort when forcing priests or nuns to violate sacred principles. Others seemed driven by a particular hatred for clergy, as if their very existence challenged the Nazi worldview. One notorious guard in Block 28, documented in multiple survivor accounts, had been an altar boy before joining the SS. He took special pleasure in forcing priests to blaspheme or desecrate religious items, suggesting a personal battle with the faith he had abandoned. Yet survivors also recalled rare instances of guards showing unexpected mercy, looking away during secret prayer services, or occasionally slipping extra food to elderly nuns. These contradictions reflected the moral dissonance at the heart of the Nazi system, where even the most indoctrinated perpetrators sometimes struggled with the implications of their actions against religious figures who had once been respected in German and Polish society. For Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz, Catholic clergy sometimes became unexpected allies. Despite historical tensions between Judaism and Christianity, the shared experience of persecution created new bonds of solidarity in the camp. Multiple Jewish survivors described Catholic priests who helped them maintain their own religious practices by warning them of approaching guards during prayer times or helping them track Jewish calendar dates. When a group of Jewish women were discovered with a makeshift prayer book, a Polish nun working in the laundry hid it in her own belongings, returning it to them days later at great personal risk. Father Adam Zieber recounted after the war how he and other priests developed a theological understanding of their imprisonment that recognized their Jewish fellow prisoners as elder brothers in faith suffering under the same evil. This evolving interfaith solidarity represented an unintended consequence of Nazi persecution, creating connections between religious groups that would have significant impact in post-war religious dialogue and eventually influence Catholic Church teachings on Jewish-Christian relations decades later. The presence of Catholic clergy in Auschwitz created particular challenges for the camp's administrative hierarchy. Unlike most prisoners, priests and nuns had been public figures in their communities before the war, with networks of supporters who sought information about their fate. The German bishops, while largely silent about Jewish deportations, did make inquiries about imprisoned Catholic clergy through Vatican diplomatic channels. This outside attention occasionally resulted in nominal improvements, like the permission eventually granted for a single weekly Mass under strict supervision in 1944. However, these concessions masked the continuing reality of deliberate decimation of the clergy population. Camp administrators maintained dual records showing privileged treatment of religious prisoners for outside inquiries while continuing the harsh conditions that ensured high mortality rates. This cynical administrative approach represented a sophisticated aspect of the Nazi system, creating plausible deniability about the treatment of high-profile prisoners while continuing their systematic destruction. For the clergy in blocks 27 and 28, these occasional privileges did little to mitigate their suffering, but did provide small openings through which they could extend spiritual care to fellow prisoners. As 1944 progressed and Soviet forces advanced toward Poland, a new desperation infected the atmosphere of Auschwitz. Camp administrators accelerated the pace of killings while beginning to destroy evidence of their crimes. For the remaining clergy in blocks 27 and 28, this period brought both intensified danger and new opportunities for ministry. As the camp system began to break down under the pressure of impending defeat, some guards became more brutal, while others grew lax in enforcement, creating unpredictable conditions. The priests and nuns who had survived years of imprisonment now faced perhaps their greatest spiritual challenge, maintaining hope and faith during the chaotic final phase of the camp's existence when death seemed more arbitrary than ever. Survivor accounts describe how religious services became more frequent yet more dangerous during these months, with clergy taking greater risks to provide spiritual comfort as the sense of impending liberation mingled with fear of last-minute massacres. Father Kozlowiecki documented in his post-war writings how he and other priests began openly giving blessings to prisoners being loaded onto evacuation transports, sometimes while guards watched but did not intervene, a sign of the collapsing authority structure. The medical experiments conducted on prisoners in Auschwitz included specific programs targeting Catholic clergy. While these atrocities have received less historical attention than the more documented experiments on Jewish prisoners, survivor testimony and Nazi medical records revealed disturbing patterns. Doctors selected priests for starvation studies, measuring their physiological and psychological responses to prolonged food deprivation. Research partially motivated by interest in understanding religious practices of fasting. Nuns were frequently chosen for sterilization experiments, as Nazi racial ideology was particularly concerned with preventing inferior Polish women from reproducing. One survivor nun testified after the war about a doctor who told her during a painful procedure, "This is so the Church will not have future generations of sisters." Beyond these targeted experiments, clergy were also subjected to the general range of pseudoscientific medical horrors inflicted on prisoners: high-altitude simulations, hypothermia tests, and experimental drugs. These medical abuses represented a particularly intimate violation for men and women who had consecrated their bodies to religious service, creating profound theological questions about suffering that many struggled to reconcile with their faith. For the Catholic Church hierarchy outside the camp, the imprisonment of clergy in Auschwitz presented an excruciating dilemma. Vatican diplomats had negotiated agreements with Nazi authorities that theoretically protected some clergy, especially those from Western European countries, but these protections rarely extended to Polish priests and almost never to those of Jewish heritage. The decision by some bishops to publicly protest deportations, like the Dutch bishop's statement that triggered the arrest of Edith Stein and other Catholic converts from Judaism, created agonizing questions about when to speak out and when silence might better protect vulnerable populations. Inside Auschwitz, imprisoned priests debated these same questions among themselves, with some criticizing Pope Pius XIII for not condemning Nazi atrocities more forcefully, while others defended the Vatican's cautious approach as necessary to prevent even worse persecution. This internal debate about the proper response to systematic evil would continue long after the war, shaping Catholic theology and church policies in subsequent decades. For the priests and nuns in blocks 27 and 28, however, such high-level strategic considerations meant little compared to the immediate moral imperative they felt to minister to the suffering around them regardless of personal risk. The clergy blocks contained extraordinary examples of moral courage that challenged simplistic narratives about human behavior under extreme conditions. Catholic nuns who worked in camp administration offices occasionally managed to alter records to protect vulnerable prisoners, while priests used their connections with civilian workers to smuggle messages to resistance networks outside the camp. One Polish priest, whose name was not recorded in surviving documents, maintained a secret list of SS officers responsible for specific atrocities, which he updated and passed along through the underground until it eventually reached Allied intelligence. These acts of resistance required not just physical courage, but moral clarity in an environment designed to blur ethical boundaries. Yet the historical record also contains uncomfortable examples of moral compromise. Clergy who accepted privileged positions that separated them from other prisoners, or who limited their ministry to fellow Catholics when others were in equal need. These complex moral choices made under unimaginable pressure reveal the full humanity of these religious prisoners, neither reducing them to one-dimensional saints nor dismissing their extraordinary sacrifices. The experience of imprisonment transformed the theology of many surviving clergy in profound ways. Traditional religious concepts about suffering, evil, and God's presence were challenged by the realities of Auschwitz in ways that academic theology could never prepare them for. Some priests described experiencing a dark night of the soul, where God seemed entirely absent from the gas chambers and crematoria. Others developed new understandings of Christ's suffering on the cross that found meaning in their own torments. One nun who survived 3 years in the camp wrote after liberation that she had learned more about the nature of God in Auschwitz than in all my years in the convent, not because God was more present there, but because the questions were more urgent. Many clergy who entered the camp with abstract theological concepts left with embodied faith tested by fire. For some, this meant abandoning religion entirely, unable to reconcile traditional beliefs with what they had witnessed. For others, it meant a deeper, more nuanced faith that acknowledged both divine presence and apparent absence in human suffering. This theological evolution, born in the crucible of blocks 27 and 28, would eventually influence Catholic thought far beyond the survivors themselves, as their written reflections and testimonies challenged the Church to confront difficult questions about evil, suffering, and divine justice in the modern world. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz, forcing prisoners on brutal death marches westward through snow and freezing temperatures. For the remaining clergy in blocks 27 and 28, this final phase presented an excruciating test. Many priests chose to stay with the sick and dying who could not be evacuated, knowing this likely meant their own deaths when the SS returned to eliminate witnesses. Others joined the marches, where they continued their ministry under even more desperate conditions. Father Vladislav Grosz described walking between columns of staggering prisoners, whispering prayers and offering absolution to those who collapsed. Forbidden from stopping to help the fallen, who were typically shot by guards, priests developed ways to give last rites while appearing to stumble themselves, briefly kneeling beside the dying as if adjusting their own shoes. The few surviving nuns joined women's evacuation columns, where they faced additional dangers of sexual assault by guards increasingly unrestrained by discipline. Sister Maria Immacolata, one of the few Italian nuns imprisoned at Auschwitz, documented how women on these marches formed protective circles around the most vulnerable, with former prisoners later recounting how the quiet leadership of religious women created small islands of compassion amid the final horrors of the collapsing camp system. When Soviet troops finally entered Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found approximately 7,000 prisoners who had been too weak to evacuate, or who had hidden during the chaotic final days. Among them were several dozen Catholic clergy who had remained to care for the sick. These liberation accounts contain remarkable scenes of priests emerging from hiding places in the infirmary buildings, still wearing tattered striped uniforms but conducting religious services openly for the first time in years. One Soviet Jewish officer described his surprise at discovering a Polish nun tending to dying prisoners in a barracks that SS guards had intended to burn. She could barely stand herself, he reported, but refused evacuation until all her patients had been recorded and transported to hospitals. The liberation period revealed how deeply the religious identity of these clergy had sustained them. Many immediately sought to establish proper burial rituals for the dead and create sacred spaces amid the industrial architecture of death. These acts represented not just spiritual comfort, but an assertion of human dignity that the camp had tried systematically to destroy. The physical and psychological scars carried by surviving clergy from blocks 27 and 28 shaped their post-war lives and ministries in profound ways. Many experienced what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, suffering nightmares, flashbacks, and difficulty reintegrating into normal religious life. Some found they could no longer perform certain rituals that triggered camp memories, while others developed overwhelming compulsions around food that complicated their return to communal religious living. Church authorities often struggled to understand these reactions, sometimes mistaking trauma symptoms for spiritual or psychological weakness. Yet many survivors transformed their suffering into remarkable post-war service. Father Kozlowiecki went on to become a missionary and eventually cardinal in Zambia, where he built schools and hospitals. Several French priests who survived became leaders in prison ministry, while Polish nuns established orphanages for children who had lost parents in the camps and death marches. These religious survivors often explained their continued service as both a form of healing and a testament to the faith that had sustained them, their way of affirming that what happened in Auschwitz would not have the final word in their lives. The historical record of Catholic clergy in Auschwitz remains incomplete due to both Nazi document destruction and post-war political complications. After Soviet forces liberated Poland, the new communist government had its own ideological reasons for minimizing religious elements in Holocaust narratives. Catholic clergy who survived faced suspicion from authorities who viewed the church as a potential center of anti-communist resistance. Their testimonies were often suppressed or modified to fit official historical accounts that emphasized political rather than religious persecution. Additionally, Cold War divisions meant that survivor accounts published in Western Europe rarely reached readers behind the Iron Curtain, while Eastern European testimonies remained untranslated and unavailable to Western historians for decades. This fragmentation of historical memory was further complicated by sensitive questions about the broader Catholic Church's response to the Holocaust, creating reluctance among some church authorities to highlight the clergy's victimization at Auschwitz, lest it appear to minimize or deflect from Jewish suffering. The result was a historical silence around blocks 27 and 28 that has only begun to be addressed by scholars in recent decades. Perhaps the most significant legacy of the clergy experience in Auschwitz was its influence on Catholic-Jewish relations in the decades following the war. Surviving priests and nuns who had witnessed the genocide of European Jews firsthand often became passionate advocates for reconciliation between the faiths. Polish Cardinal August Hlond, who had made problematic statements about Jews before the war, was profoundly changed by accounts from priest survivors of Auschwitz, becoming an early advocate for theological reforms regarding how Catholicism viewed Judaism. Father Adam Zieber dedicated his post-war ministry to documenting both Catholic and Jewish suffering, creating some of the earliest educational programs that taught Christians about the full scope of the Holocaust. These survivor-driven initiatives helped prepare the ground for the Second Vatican Council's landmark declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965, which transformed the Church's official stance toward Judaism and rejected anti-Semitism. The shared suffering of Catholic clergy and Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz thus contributed, indirectly but significantly, to one of the most important interfaith developments of the 20th century. As one rabbi who had been imprisoned alongside Catholic priests in Block 28 later reflected, "In that place where humanity reached its lowest point, the seeds were also planted for its moral renewal, not because suffering itself is redemptive, but because some who suffered refused to let it destroy their recognition of our common humanity." The full scope of clergy deaths in Auschwitz may never be precisely known. Historical research has documented at least 464 priests, seminarians and monks, along with 35 nuns who were deported to the camp between 1940 and 1945. Of these, fewer than 20% survived. Polish clergy suffered the highest mortality rate, with some estimates suggesting that nearly half of all Catholic priests in certain Polish dioceses perished either in Auschwitz or other concentration camps. These statistics, however, likely undercount the true toll, as many religious prisoners were not identified as clergy in camp records, particularly if they were arrested for resistance activities rather than their religious status. Others deliberately concealed their religious vocations upon arrival, hoping to avoid the special torments reserved for priests and nuns. The deaths occurred through various means. Some were selected for immediate gassing upon arrival, particularly those who were elderly or infirm. Others succumbed to starvation, disease, or the effects of slave labor. A significant number were executed for specific offenses against camp rules, often related to religious activities. When combined with clergy killings at other camps like Dachau, where over 1,000 priests died, the Nazi persecution represents the largest systematic murder of Catholic religious since the French Revolution. The personal belongings of imprisoned clergy reveal poignant details about their experience. When Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz, they discovered hidden caches of religious items that prisoners had risked their lives to preserve. Tiny crosses fashioned from breadcrumbs hardened and saved for months. Prayer books with microscopic handwriting to conserve paper. Rosaries made from knotted strings, and in one remarkable case, a small chalice carved from wood and hidden in a floorboard of Block 28. Perhaps most moving were the journals and letters never sent, now preserved in archives across Europe. One Polish nun had kept a diary written on toilet paper and scraps of packaging material, recording not just the horrors she witnessed, but also moments of unexpected beauty. A sunset glimpsed through barbed wire, an act of kindness from another prisoner, the sound of secret singing at Christmas. These artifacts speak to the determination to maintain spiritual practices and human dignity in an environment designed to destroy both. Museum curators who work with these items often note their powerful emotional impact on visitors, as they provide tangible connections to the inner lives of those who suffered. The story of Catholic clergy in Auschwitz challenges simple narratives about religious persecution during the Holocaust. While these priests and nuns were undoubtedly victims of Nazi brutality, some were simultaneously implicated in the complex history of Christian anti-Semitism that contributed to the cultural environment in which the Holocaust became possible. Pre-war sermons from some of the same clergy who later perished in the camps sometimes contained anti-Jewish rhetoric that reflected centuries of theological hostility. This uncomfortable historical reality creates tensions in commemoration. How to honor their suffering and resistance without idealizing or oversimplifying their place in European religious history. Scholars and religious leaders continue to wrestle with these complexities, seeking balanced approaches that acknowledge both the heroic martyrdom of many Catholic clergy and the need for honest reckoning with Christianity's role in fostering anti-Semitic attitudes. This nuanced understanding has become increasingly important in interfaith dialogue, as both Jewish and Catholic leaders work to honor all victims of Nazi persecution while maintaining historical accuracy about the distinct experiences of different groups targeted by the regime. The story of Blocks 27 and 28 remained largely untold in American public consciousness for decades after the war. While figures like Maximilian Kolbe achieved recognition through canonization, the broader experience of imprisoned clergy faded from historical memory outside Poland and specialized academic circles. Several factors contributed to this obscurity. Cold War politics made accessing Eastern European archives difficult for Western historians, while communist authorities were reluctant to emphasize religious aspects of Nazi persecution. Additionally, as Holocaust education developed in the United States, it understandably centered Jewish victims who represented the vast majority of those murdered at Auschwitz. Necessary focus on anti-Semitism as the driving ideology behind the Holocaust sometimes left little room for exploring the regime's parallel hostility toward religious authorities who challenged Nazi supremacy. Popular media representations further narrowed public understanding, with films and books rarely depicting the clergy experience. Even within Catholic education, the full story of what happened in these blocks was often simplified to focus on individual saints rather than the systematic nature of clergy persecution or its ideological underpinnings in the Nazi worldview. Recent years have seen renewed interest in recovering this neglected chapter of Holocaust history. Researchers have conducted new oral history projects with the few remaining survivors and witnesses, while archivists have digitized previously inaccessible documents from Eastern European collections. Museums at former campsites have developed exhibits specifically addressing the clergy experience, placing it in context with the broader Holocaust while acknowledging its distinctive elements. This scholarly attention has revealed important insights about how the Nazi regime targeted different groups for different reasons, with anti-Semitism remaining the central ideological driver, while anti-Catholic persecution reflected additional concerns about competing sources of authority and Polish national identity. For historians, this more comprehensive picture helps explain the full scope of Nazi totalitarianism, not just its racial obsessions, but its fundamental opposition to any power that claimed authority beyond the state. For religious communities, these emerging historical narratives provide opportunities for more nuanced commemoration that honors Catholic martyrs while acknowledging the primary place of Jewish suffering in Holocaust history and education. The story of Blocks 27 and 28 thus continues to evolve, moving from historical footnote to recognized component of our understanding of Auschwitz's complex history. Today, the physical spaces of Blocks 27 and 28 stand as silent witnesses at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. Unlike some barracks that have been reconstructed to show typical prisoner living conditions, these blocks contain exhibits focused on specific national groups deported to the camp. The unique history of their function as clergy housing is marked only by small informational plaques that many visitors overlook. This relative invisibility in the memorial landscape reflects ongoing challenges in representing the complex layers of persecution at Auschwitz. Museum curators face difficult decisions about how to present the multiplicity of victim experiences without creating inappropriate hierarchies of suffering or diluting the site's primary significance as the largest cemetery of European Jews. Conservation specialists working at the museum note that physical evidence of religious life remains embedded in the buildings themselves. Small crosses scratched into bunk posts, prayer texts hidden in wall cavities, and other traces that continue to be discovered during preservation work. These material remnants provide tangible connections to the spiritual resistance that once occurred within these walls, though they remain largely inaccessible to typical visitors following standard tour routes through the sprawling complex. The legacy of Catholic clergy imprisoned at Auschwitz extends far beyond the physical memorial space. Their experience fundamentally transformed Catholic theology regarding suffering, interfaith relations, and resistance to totalitarianism. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, was significantly influenced by survivor theologians who had witnessed both Jewish and Catholic persecution firsthand, leading to historic changes in church teachings about Judaism and shared spiritual heritage. Pope John Paul II, who lived through the Nazi occupation of Poland as a young man and knew many priests who perished in the camps, repeatedly highlighted the testimony of Auschwitz in his teachings about human dignity and religious freedom. His unprecedented visits to synagogues and public repentance for Christian anti-Semitism drew explicitly on the lessons of clergy survivor accounts. Beyond institutional religion, the witness of priests and nuns who chose to remain with the suffering rather than save themselves has inspired philosophical reflections on moral choice under extreme conditions from thinkers ranging from Hannah Arendt to Emmanuel Levinas. Their example challenges comfortable assumptions about human behavior under pressure, demonstrating both the possibility of maintaining moral agency in seemingly impossible circumstances and the rarity of such courage. For Jewish-Catholic relations, the shared but distinct suffering at Auschwitz created both opportunities for understanding and potential for misunderstanding. Theological interpretations of the Holocaust have developed differently within the two faith traditions, sometimes leading to tensions when Catholic commentators incorporate priests' suffering into broader religious narratives about martyrdom and redemptive suffering. Jewish scholars have rightfully emphasized the uniqueness of the systematic attempt to eliminate all Jews as a people, a genocidal project fundamentally different from the persecution Catholics faced as a potential source of Polish nationalist resistance. Yet moments of genuine interfaith breakthrough have also emerged from engagement with this history, particularly when survivors from both traditions shared their stories directly with each other. One remarkable post-war initiative brought together Jewish survivors and Catholic clergy who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz for annual dialogue retreats, creating space for both commemorating distinct suffering and recognizing shared humanity. These encounters produced insights about the theological significance of Auschwitz that neither tradition could have developed in isolation, demonstrating how even history's darkest chapters can ultimately serve interfaith understanding when approached with sensitivity and respect for difference. The story of Blocks 27 and 28 carries particular relevance for contemporary questions about religious persecution and genocide. As the world continues to witness targeted violence against religious groups in regions from Myanmar to Nigeria, the clergy experience at Auschwitz provides historical perspective on how totalitarian systems view religious authority as a threat. Modern human rights frameworks increasingly recognize that genocidal violence often targets religious leadership, specifically because they represent moral authority outside state control and preserve cultural identity that regimes seek to eradicate. International courts handling cases of crimes against humanity now routinely examine evidence of specific persecution of clergy as indicators of genocidal intent. Scholars studying contemporary mass atrocities have identified patterns first documented in Auschwitz, where perpetrators develop specialized techniques to break religious resistance through humiliation, forced violation of sacred principles, and attacks on religious symbols. These historical insights have practical applications in developing early warning systems for potential genocide and creating more effective protection mechanisms for vulnerable religious communities. The testimony that emerged from the clergy blocks thus continues to inform not just historical understanding, but ongoing human rights work and genocide prevention efforts around the world. The hidden history of Catholic clergy in Auschwitz reminds us that historical memory is never static or complete. As remaining survivors pass away and direct testimony becomes increasingly rare, responsibility for preserving this chapter of history falls to new generations who encounter it through documents, artifacts, and memorial spaces. Digital humanities projects now work to collect scattered records from archives across Europe, creating comprehensive databases of clergy prisoners that restore individual identities to those who were reduced to numbers. Educational initiatives bring this history to students through curriculum materials that place Catholic persecution within the broader context of the Holocaust, while honoring its distinctive elements. Religious communities develop commemoration practices that connect historical suffering to contemporary commitments to human rights and interfaith understanding. These diverse approaches to remembrance ensure that what happened in Blocks 27 and 28 will not be forgotten, even as its meaning continues to evolve. The story of the priests and nuns of Auschwitz thus remains unfinished, not just a historical account of what happened during those dark years, but an ongoing conversation about faith under fire, moral courage in impossible circumstances, and the human capacity to maintain dignity even in history's darkest corners. Their testimony challenges us to remember not just how they died, but how they lived, finding ways to serve others, even when stripped of everything except the conviction that every human life, regardless of faith or background, holds inherent and sacred worth.